Thank you so much. Jane, you just have such insight about the kind of conversations we should be having, and I'm so appreciative that you invited me. Stacy, thank you so much for all of the work that you do, not just this conference, but all of the others. It's really remarkable that you help us pull it together. And of course, Lee. So Lee's written this book, which sets out this amazing foundation for a discussion or maybe a debate, a teaching resource, ways that we can improve our advocacy on a number of critical issues. Her very title, Decriminalizing Domestic Violence, encourages us to think about the relationship between political and economic power and how those forces produce acts that we've determined are criminal and who we designate as criminals. So my remarks about this remarkable book consider Lee's contributions about the role of market forces and gender violence and how that relationship functions in context of neoliberalism, the ideology that's based around a belief in so-called markets and a predilection for a state that is supervised by the market instead of the market being controlled by the state. So as Lee has demonstrated, we have new concerns that have emerged that really challenge us to think about our past principle reliance on criminalization as a response to domestic violence. And we know changing circumstances have made it quite clear that we just cannot define this problem as one that is steeped in patriarchy and patriarchy alone. So to fully explain this dynamic of this problem that we're also concerned about, we have to explore the private in the context of the public, the social and the moral in the context of the political and economic. In her chapter on domestic violence as an economic problem, Lee addresses a number of really important themes. I'm going to try to consolidate them for the sake of time and address two, or put them together as two. The first, briefly, the economic cost of IPV, and that would include economic abuse as a particular strategy of domestic violence. And then I want to talk a little bit about the structural issues, not so much the individual personal way that this is manifested, but how the structural issues really affect this huge social problem. And so I want to outline the important contributions that she's made in these categories, and I want to suggest that where she lands us provides kind of a roadmap for where we might think about going next to do some critical and creative advocacy around gender violence. So she provides an overview of the economic costs of gender violence on a national level. I think the figure she suggests is $67 billion a year, which we can't conceive of. At some point, numbers just are like numbers. She also reviews the phenomenon of economic abuse, where abusers actually use as a strategy to control women so that they cannot be productive in the workplace. And we know that women are actually at a heightened risk of physical abuse at the moment that she's attempting to seek economic independence. So I want to talk a little bit also about financial abuse, which is a subset of economic abuse. And it focuses on money and finances. Abusers deny a victim information about finances. They control all of the decisions about household economics. They engage in identity and property theft. They incur debt through coercive and surreptitious means, and they will coerce her to file a fraudulent tax return, which has long-lasting consequences. All of this does. So where does Lee's insightful commentary about IPV and the economic point us? I want us to think about the legal response sharply. So we have good data about the consequences of economic abuse. We know what it does to women in the workplace: wages, lack of work, unemployment, and the like. But we don't know, we have not measured whether the legal responses to that kind of abuse are useful. And that's because we're always thinking about the physical violence, even though the economic violence lasts for decades. So I'm going to go through some federal statutes and then some state remedies. So on the federal level, we've got the Violence Against Women Act, We've got welfare reform's family violence option, which was meant to mitigate the consequences of welfare reform on victims of domestic violence. And we've got tax codes. So I don't know, how many of you know about tax code relief for victims of domestic violence? So if you don't know it, I'll tell you very generally, there are ways that if you are a victim of a fraudulent return, you can get what's generically called innocent spouse relief. There's a number of ways that you can seek tax relief. I'm not going to go into all of them because I will cry if I had to. But I want to talk about these provisions seemingly directed at economic abuse. And I say seemingly for two reasons. First of all, the laws that have been created to address economic abuse have been rendered useless. And I'm going to tell you why. So first of all, VAWA. VAWA is a civil rights remedy. It was creating a cause of action that was meant to obtain economic relief, pecuniary relief, money in the pocket, attorney's fees. It was overturned by the Supreme Court that could not agree that women's national economy was an issue that they wanted to address. So struck down as unconstitutional. But there's another reason why VAWA is useless, and that is because, and Julie Goldscheid has written about this early on, she observed that civil rights claims against individuals, which is all that VAWA ever authorized, is not nearly as useful as lawsuits against institutions. It just doesn't produce the money. And she also observes that because of that, there's an inherent class bias in that VAWA civil rights remedy, because it privileges those with partners who have sufficient wealth, who have a pocket from which they can pay. As was mentioned in the Q&A, there are folks that are not going to go to court if their experiences with the court has been discriminatory and abusive, or if they can't speak English proficiently, because our courts are not equipped yet to fully deal with limited English proficient people. And then, of course, VAWA, the remainder of the statute, is principally privileging the apparatus of the carceral state. What about the family violence option, meant to lessen the harm caused by welfare reform? It is just an option. It's optional. And although most, if not all, of the states have enacted the family violence option, we do know from studies it has done nothing. Women aren't screened, they're not given services, they're not told about it. It has done nothing. But also think about welfare reform and the family violence option in the context of our U.S. welfare model. Our U.S. welfare model is one that is designed to give the fewest benefits, minimal benefits to the fewest people, because our ideology is pull yourself up by your bootstraps. We do not fund a welfare system. Compared to any other industrialized country, it is shameful. So tax relief could be a significant mitigating legal remedy. For those who have been forced to file a tax return that is fraudulent or in some ways inaccurate, the studies show that you can suffer economic consequences for decades, long-lasting problems when you have tax problems. So there are tax relief provisions, but they are so onerous, and there are so many exceptions to the exception to tax relief that they're useless. And they're risky. You have to notify the abuser that you're going to seek to get out from this joint tax liability. So it doesn't really work. And again, put it in context of the political economy. Our tax code has done such a poor job of redistributing wealth in this country. In fact, it has done the opposite in terms of what tax policies could do. You've seen the most recent tax law that passed. You know the rich get richer, the poor get poorer. So we really can't think, if we want to think intersectionally about this problem, that tax law is going to do anything for domestic violence victims. So the same is true about state remedies. So we talked about civil protection orders. Civil protection orders can grant economic relief. They don't. So many studies about the attitude of judges about these cases. Go elsewhere. File a child support enforcement claim. Not in my court. Doesn't happen here. Divorce-related matters, if you happen to be married to your abuser, that's not much better. You know, it's interesting. We moved from fault and protection of the woman, spouse, and her economic interests following divorce to a no-fault system. And now, there are studies that show family law attorneys, they don't want to know about domestic violence. No, don't tell me that. It's not going to matter to the judge because we're a no-fault state. It's not going to enter into it. The calculation doesn't concern marital misconduct. No, no, no. So we're not getting any kind of relief in terms of what the statutes could provide. Again, put it into context. Family law distribution claims are a zero-sum struggle for most people for resources. Our state does not provide individuals with the resources they need to sustain families. And so family law doesn't invoke the public coffers. It doesn't invoke benefits. It's a private matter. You either have something to distribute if you're lucky enough to get a judge to consider it, or you don't. And for most of the families affected by domestic violence, they don't have the resources. And domestic violence is not going to change that. So if the law has been failing us on the issue of remedies for economic abuse, what about our policy and advocacy strategies? So domestic violence programs have been moving away from this sort of fixation, if you will, with the criminal justice system. And you'll see on the national websites and many state programs, financial literacy curriculum. And so I appreciate Lee's setting out their strengths and weaknesses in her efforts to come up with a reasonable, balanced approach. I'm going to tell you that I think these programs are flawed. I think they are politically expedient. I think they are focused exclusively on personal responsibility. I think they distract from the political, economic issues that affect the well-being of domestic violence victims and communities. And my critique of these programs, which is pretty strong, is offered, to borrow a phrase, in the spirit of constructive provocation. So let me tell you about these. The credit industry and debt problems are so gendered to begin with. There are such horrible stereotypes about women and credit. Do you know that we don't make good financial decisions because we're too emotional? Do you know that we ask the wrong people for advice? This comes out of the literature, the finance credit literature. I'm not just making this up. We are accused of being fiscally improvident when it comes to managing our money. The financial literacy curriculum make no mention of the historic discrimination by the credit industry, predatory practices that target women particularly, and women of color even more so. So these programs aren't considering that reality. Now, let me tell you about Allstate's Purple Purse. Do you know it has checklists and instructions? See, these are the corporate-sponsored programs that we're getting. They are as unrealistic as they are patronizing. I get so angry when I read the curriculum. Do you know that it tells us we shop and overspend for emotional reasons? And if you're a victim of domestic violence and you can't pay your debts, have a manicure at home. I am quoting, okay? Have a favorite dessert at home. Quote, go for a walk. Avoid eating out. Limit treats for your children. Find a cheaper alternative for household purchases. Shop better. You can save on your children's spending if you cook or bake with them, read them a story, or play their favorite game with them. This is what our domestic violence programs are offering. Now, we're the fiscally promiscuous Americans, right? This is the same crazy stuff about we're buying too many lattes at Starbucks. I mean, there's another version of toolkits, not all states, it's another version, also corporate sponsored. This gets me angry. It tells her not to take it personally if a landlord refuses to rent to her because she's a victim of domestic violence and does not manage to say, oh, and by the way, that might be unlawful discrimination. This is what our programs are offering to victims of domestic violence. All right. What they hide, what they obscure, and what they offer makes these pretty pernicious curricula, I would say. They preach a politics of austerity economics. It's a politics that's proven completely unrealistic and damaging to poor women. All right, I want to talk a little bit about Lee's really good articulation this morning of how structural inequality and unemployment and economic strain affects men. I mean, she told you, and we know from studies, like it or not, and we often, as parents and as siblings and as people in this culture, we sort of, in some ways, are conduit for this idea that a male identity is much more wrapped up in work than is a woman's. We still have to play some family role. But for men, it's all about shining in the workplace. And when they don't, Angela Harris talks about how if they can't fulfill this dominant role of masculinity, they may resort to hypermasculinity in an attempt to gain social status. And so, and of course, nothing I'm saying here is meant to undermine the premise of abuser accountability, but we have to think about the motivation, as someone had said earlier, if we really want to get to this problem. I mean, if you want to say, no, you have to be a feminist and that's how you're going to solve the problem, Mr. Abuser, it's not. We have to figure out the social constructs of people's identity and how we're going to deal with that. So, in that vein, I want to turn to abuser treatment programs, because I think that also there's so much we could gain if we could shift the focus of those programs. Those programs talk about abusers responsible for stopping the violence. Yeah, that makes sense. But these programs, I read 50 state programs this summer, culling through to see what they do and who they have relationships with, principally with the criminal justice system. They may identify somebody who has chronic unemployment coming into their program as needing high intensity treatment, but the treatment is at best, and I don't even know if I should say if this is at best, maybe at worst, I don't know. You have to get a job. And if you don't, I'm going to tell your probation officer. And that's it. So, and what about financial literacy? A good financial literacy program for them. I mean, as Lee was explaining, you go to prison, you have a criminal record, you're not going to be able to get credit, you're going to have all sorts of problems. It's hard to make it in this economy without some line of credit. Why aren't we attending to those economic needs? So I would say that there are some really good recommendations in this book, which is a wonderful, wonderful place to land again. We've got the Center for Survivor Agency and Justice as a model. They are putting out the best damn curriculum, sorry I said damn, the best darn curriculum on financial literacy and consumer issues for victims of domestic violence. It's just great. They're looking at the predatory lenders. They're not just saying, oh, go get your credit report so you know how jammed up you are. They're saying, we're going to help you fight it. And so they're doing great work. There's also a couple of abuser treatment programs. I mean, I said I looked at 50 statewide. I know that there are many more programs that are probably doing wonderful stuff. The two I could find was the Ohio Domestic Violence Network. Their abuser treatment program does identify marginalized communities. They look at the Appalachian communities in particular with the socio-political and economic issues, geographic isolation, high unemployment, lack of public transportation. There's another one I found which I thought was really pretty awesome, the Alma Center in Wisconsin. And they partner with workforce and small business development programs, and they assist abusers in finding employment. And built into their program is this understanding that these guys are going to fail. And they're not surprised. They're there to pick them back up and move them back in and keep them going. And they've been quite successful. I could rattle off a bunch of other remedies. I really like what Mimi said about not just criticizing, but thinking about what to do. We should change our child support enforcement system. We should have uniform or universal basic income allocations for families, like some European countries have. We should have an economy that rewards home care. We should take the training for women on welfare, TANF training, and make it look like what some of the other federal workforce training programs look like, so that women aren't sent to be, and I'm not disparaging people who are housekeepers, but it's low wage compared to some of the programs designed for men that are training them to do much better skilled work. We should look, and I've written about this in the past, Workforce Investment Act programs, Trade Adjustment Assistance Act programs. There's programs out there to send perpetrators to, and it makes sense. We should be involved in, as domestic violence advocates, we should be involved in living wage campaigns. We should be involved in Fight for 15. Most of the domestic violence workers, you don't get paid enough. For crying out loud, your wages are probably, not living wage. I mean, I was talking to an organizer for 515. I was telling her I wish we could get some of the DV programs doing social justice, economic justice stuff involved. And she said, I'll say, because we have victims who are in our group who are victims of domestic violence, and we need your expertise. So I'm going to end there, except to say one last thing. Lee's final conclusion is where I hope we take up just social justice coalitions working to end all forms of oppression. Thank you, Lee, for this book.